So when in Hungary, the party that gave us the Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, came into power, we didn't expect constitutional changes. The party never campaigned on a constitutional reform. They didn't campaign on constitutional overhaul. Once they decided that they will give the Hungarian people a second chance at becoming a constitutional democracy, then the Hungarian media started to be very skeptical about the process. And the next thing you know is the Prime Minister starting to complain about left-leaning media coverage that is conspiring against the plans that are meant to reinvent the Hungarian nation. In the European Union, and Hungary is a member of the European Union, you cannot quite freely re-regulate the media space. So there is plenty of European level protection that ties your hands. In the Hungarian case, much of the media overhaul happened through ownership reforms and media companies changing hands, being shifted to government-friendly businesses. In the Hungarian case, we are not only talking about the print media and electronic media, but one segment of the media market which you wouldn't expect, which is advertising and public billboards. Control over the contents of public billboards literally permits the regime to pack, as if a Christmas package, the public square into government propaganda. In the current setup, what you essentially have is extremely limited opportunity for a genuine political discourse. By now, in 10 years' time, even the regional newspapers are owned by government-friendly media conglomerates. There is also government-friendly ownership for freely handed out newspapers, the papers which you pick up at the metro station. So much of the critical content is on online media, and this is where data-driven investigative journalism gets to publish whatever they get access to through access to information legislation. You really live in a saturated media space where there is very little room to express opposition voices. This also means that the MPs in parliament who belong to the opposition have very little opportunity to talk to their voters. As a result, the speech of opposition parliamentarians in parliament becomes very unusual because they have to use very limited opportunities to grab attention. This is why they are using major posters and even megaphones in parliament, breaching the rules of parliamentary procedure in order to try to get their message through. The result of media saturation, however, is that whenever the government goes into elections, they have significant advantage because they control access to both print and online media, and on top of that, of course, they are savvy users of social media. The one component or the one difference that you have between Hungary and Poland is that in Poland you still have some independent-owned media that permits access to the opposition to proper public discourse. The similarity between Poland and Brazil is that leaks of conversations which were never meant to be surveyed or taped became part and parcel of fighting against political opponents, and of course the government and government-friendly content wins the day. When it comes to the role of organized religion and these regimes, the Hungarian story and the Polish story differ considerably. In Poland, the Catholic Church is a very dominant social force. It has great credentials in transition to democracy. You may remember that at the time of the third wave of democratization, we had a Pope, John Paul II, who was of Polish origin, and the Polish Catholic Church has has recognized credentials in transition to democracy. The church, however, is a very conservative social force, and this in part explains why, for instance, Poland never liberalized its abortion regime to the point of several other European countries. So in Poland, it's extremely easy for the regime to align itself with the more conservative traits of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church provides open support for a government which is in favor of traditional values, which protects the family, which is openly opposing LGBT rights. Feminism is a dirty word, and gender and anything that has to do with gender equality is officially laughed at. The position of the Catholic Church actually permits the government to act as a defender of Christianity. And in this particular constellation, feminists and LGBT activists are very often painted as persecuting Christians in Poland, which sounds very odd if you realize that you are in a Catholic majority country. Now, the Hungarian story is slightly more complicated. Hungary is a majority Christian country, much less religious than Poland. In Hungary, you had several smaller Christian churches which were pursuing missions, that is, faith-based missions, that went against the government's policy preferences. One of these churches manages to run a homeless shelter in a country where criminalization of homelessness is part and parcel of government policy of defending Hungarian identity. They also support refugees in a country which has a very outspoken anti-refugee and anti-migrant agenda. So within the Hungarian liberal agenda, it has become extremely central from the beginning to re-regulate church and state relations. The Hungarian parliament passed a new law on access to legal entity status that stopped or cancelled the previous church status of more than 300 registered churches, and it gave the power to parliament to decide who is a church and who is not. So imagine you are a pastor, a minister in a religious community which runs a school, a homeless shelter, which has a refugee program, and for 10 years or almost 10 years, you don't have a tax ID, you don't have legal entity. How do you pay your employees? And how do you even have a phone number that belongs not to you personally, but to the organization, which is actually a faith-based community? Now that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is how do these countries mobilize Christianity as part of an illiberal constitutional and political agenda. The Hungarian fundamental law from its very beginning included several references to Christianity. One of the most important sentences is how Hungary protected Europe and European identity against Turkish invasion a few centuries before in order to preserve Europe's Christian identity. As I already mentioned, the Hungarian political project was labeled by the Prime Minister as building an illiberal democracy. After his re-election for the third time in 2018, Prime Minister Orbán declared that building illiberal democracy was over. Now he's on a mission to build a Christian democracy, because Christian democracy by definition is illiberal, and it's going to be, Christianity is now becoming the yardstick of telling friends and enemies apart. This is certainly not the understanding of Christian democracy in the German sense of and German politics, but rather this is mobilizing Christianity in a very political sense that also resonates very well with Christian conservatives in the United States. Last but not least, Christianity and Christian identity in this politicized sense makes it possible for the Prime Minister to project Hungary as a victim of, or an actual or potential victim of persecution on account of its Christianity. So much of the anti-refugee and anti-migrant agenda is actually pursued now as defense of Christianity from a Muslim invasion, and Christianity and especially Catholicism being universal makes this victimhood narrative particularly potent, because any time there is an attack on Christians around the world, the Prime Minister can point to how Christians are in danger, and this is why the government needs to take further measures in order to defend its Christian identity by illiberal means. When you watch illiberal regimes from a distance, it might seem random that the academic profession, universities as well as professors, are targeted by these regimes. This is not unique to Hungary or Poland. You see mass firings and mass measures against university professors in Turkey. This is also a practice greatly practiced in Russia. To explain what the problem with the universities is, of course you can say that these regimes, being populist, are deeply anti-elitist. So they don't need smart people, but there is more to this. They don't need people who criticize them in the public square. And it's very clear that both in Poland and in Hungary, much of the initial criticism against the measures which these governments were taking came from academia. So the attacks on universities and academics themselves are part of a larger project of suppressing and silencing dissent to the extent possible. Now, the measures sometimes are personal, which means prosecuting particular professors for opinions which they expressed in the press, but they are also much more systemic and institutional. Many of these professors work at state universities. State universities receive their budgets from the government. So universities can perfectly be disciplined through budget cuts, through appointing financial administrators known as chancellors in order to control their spending, also through scholarships and allocation of funding for students to study at particular places, and last not but least by funding for the salaries of professors. Even if you actually provide in the end all the funding to a university which it was promised in the beginning of the academic year, if they receive this funding late in the day or they are not sure about receiving this funding, that's sufficient to keep universities on their toes and to bring them in line with the ideology and value preferences of a particular regime. Minor things can also make a major difference. Governments control universities through licensing rules, otherwise known as accreditation. In 2018, the Hungarian government decided that gender studies was not a field of academic inquiry, it was an ideology. So they stopped funding gender studies programs and also halted the accreditation of the teaching of gender studies. This is a very clear content-based restriction on academic freedom. The reason why these regimes are going after universities in these particular manners is that, surprising as it may sound, the protection of academic freedom as a human right is extremely weak. What we know for sure is that the speech of individual professors in the public discourse is protected as ordinary freedom of speech, but when it comes to the protection of university autonomy, and the operational conditions of universities, such as their funding, there is almost no serious source for human rights protection, especially on the regional level. So these measures become a free-for-all for illiberal democracies. There is no international or regional force that will tell a national government that instead of funding legal education, the humanities or the social sciences, they should not divert all these funds to, say, IT or veterinary sciences. So this is what they are doing in order to silence the lawyers and the economists who are criticizing unorthodox political choices. So let me tell you a great Hungarian story about illiberal democracy and public schools and primary education. Unlike with universities when it comes to content, primary education is very easy to control content-wise. You can insist that in order for the proper development of youth, you need a national curriculum. And of course, this national curriculum can ensure the proper tailoring and proper messaging of children from a very early age. This is where you transmit traditional values and you make sure that youth do not get corrupted by ideas such as your parents are not being married or they are not going to church or otherwise are not believing in the right way of life. Another battleground clearly is sex education, both in Hungary and in Poland, and especially telling about alternative ways of life, which let's face it, would corrupt youth. So it's important for the government to make sure that children get the proper message from an early age about proper traditional values and the place of family in society. So the curriculum itself is a battleground. In Hungary, you have tighter and tighter controls over the contents of primary school textbooks. And the way you do this is even if there is a menu of options, you have licensing requirements and approvals about over the range of textbooks the schools can and the teachers can choose from. In one textbook, for instance, it's recommended to primary school children in Hungary to go home after school and ask their parents why they are not baptized if they are not baptized. Now imagine having that conversation at home over the dinner table. In addition, primary education is a perfect means of maintaining inequalities and especially ensuring that social mobility is as slow as humanly possible. Hungary is certainly not as diverse as Brazil. We have one group of a visible minority, which sometimes is defined as an ethnic minority, the Roma people. Roma people happen to have serious disadvantages in getting to anything that counts as a good life when it comes to proper employment and a decent manner of living. Study after study shows that this starts at primary school and that Roma children have a much less likelihood of even completing primary education. The bottom line is that schools, ever since Brown versus Board of Education, have been the place of educating good citizens. Illiberal governments know that citizenship education starts in primary schools, and they make sure that both the curriculum and the educational environment serves their own purposes.